Today we have some more actual history about the early days of our American Republic. We will be reading about some Indian attacks that occurred on what was then the western frontier of the United States, in Bourbon County, Kentucky around 1787 and later in 1791. We will hear a very unique story about a white Indian who attempted to desert the Indian war party he was with and stay with the white settlers. We will also hear about the heroic defense of a Kentucky frontier home by a woman, Mrs. John Merrill. We will be reading from this book, Incidents of Border Life by Jospeh Pritts. This book was published all the way back in 1838. The first incident we will hear about occurred shortly after the April 11, 1787 attack on the home of the Widow Scraggs, along with her 6 children and 1 grandchild, in Bourbon County, Kentucky. Of the 8 persons living in the home, only 3 survived. The events we are about to hear of occurred in the same neighborhood as the attack on the Widow Scraggs and her children. That may explain some of the actions taken by the white settlers in the following story, which is titled, Incidents Attending the Desertion of a Young White Man from a Party of Indians. A few weeks after the melancholy affair of the attack on the home of the Widow Scraggs, a very remarkable incident occurred in the same neighborhood of Kentucky. One morning about sunrise, a young man of wild and savage appearance suddenly arose from a cluster of bushes in front of a cabin and hailed the house in a barbarous dialect which seemed neither exactly Indian nor English, but a collection of shreds and patches from which the graces of both were carefully excluded. His skin had evidently once been white, although now grievously tanned by constant exposure to the weather. His dress in every respect was that of an Indian, as were his gestures, tones, and equipments, and his age could not be supposed to exceed 20 years. He talked volubly but uncouthly, placed his hand upon his breast, gestured vehemently, and seemed very earnestly bent upon communicating something. He was invited to enter the cabin, and the neighbors quickly collected around him. He appeared involuntarily to shrink from contact with them. His eyes rolled rapidly around with a distrustful expression from one to the other, and his whole manner was that of a wild animal just caught, and shrinking from the touch of its captors. As several present understood the Indian tongue, they at length gathered the following circumstances, as accurately as they could be translated, out of a language which seemed to be omnium gatherum, of all that was mongrel, uncouth, and barbarous. He said that he had been taken by the Indians when a child, but could neither recollect his name nor the country of his birth, that he had been adopted by an Indian warrior, who brought him up with his other sons without making the slightest difference between them, and that under his father's roof he had lived happily until within the last month. A few weeks before that time, his father, accompanied by himself and a younger brother, had hunted for some time upon the waters of the Miami, about 40 miles from the spot where Cincinnati now stands, and after all their meat, skins, etc. had been properly secured, the old man determined to gratify his children by taking them upon a war expedition to Kentucky. They accordingly built a bark canoe, in which they crossed the Ohio near the mouth of Licking, and having buried it so as to secure it from the action of the sun, they advanced into the country and encamped at the distance of 15 miles from the river. Here their father was alarmed by hearing an owl cry in a peculiar tone, which he declared boded death or captivity to themselves, if they continued their expedition, and announced his intention of returning without delay to the river. Both of his sons vehemently opposed this resolution, and at length prevailed upon the old man to disregard the owl's warning, and conduct them, as he had promised, against the frontiers of Kentucky. The party then composed themselves to sleep, but were quickly awakened by the father, who had again been warned in a dream that death awaited them in Kentucky, and again besought his children to release him from his promise, and lose no time in returning home. Again they prevailed upon him to disregard the warning, and persevere in the march. He consented to gratify them, but declared he would not remain a moment longer in the camp, which they now occupied. And accordingly they left it immediately, and marched on through the night, directing their course towards Bourbon County. In the evening they approached a house, that which he hailed and in which he was now speaking. Suddenly the desire of rejoining his people occupied his mind so strongly as to exclude every other idea, and seizing the first favorable opportunity, he had concealed himself in the bushes, and neglected to reply to all the signals which had been concerted for the purpose of collecting their army when scattered. This account appeared so extraordinary, and the young man's appearance was so wild and suspicious, that many of the neighbors suspected him of treachery, and thought that he should be arrested as a spy. Others opposed this resolution and gave full credit to his narrative. In order to satisfy themselves, however, they insisted upon his instantly conducting them to the spot where the canoe had been buried. To this the young man objected most vehemently, declaring that although he had deserted his father and brother, yet he would not betray them. Those feelings were too delicate to meet with much sympathy from the rude borderers who surrounded him, and he was given to understand that nothing short of conducting them to the point of embarkation would be accepted as an evidence of his sincerity. With obvious reluctance he at length complied. From 20 to 30 men were quickly assembled, mounted upon good horses, and under the guidance of the deserter, they moved rapidly towards the mouth of Licking. On the road, the young man informed them that he would first conduct them to the spot where they had encamped when the scream of the owl alarmed his father, and where an iron kettle had been left concealed in a hollow tree. He was probably induced to do this from the hope of delaying the pursuit so long as to afford his friends an opportunity of crossing the river in safety. But if such was his intention, no measure could have been more unfortunate. The whites approached the encampment in deep silence, and quickly perceived 2 Indians, an old man and a boy, seated by the fire and busily employed in cooking some venison. The deserter became much agitated at the sight of them, and so earnestly implored his countrymen not to kill them, that it was agreed to surround the encampment and endeavor to secure them as prisoners. This was accordingly attempted, but so desperate was the resistance of the Indians, and so determined were their efforts to escape, that the whites were compelled to fire upon them, and the old man fell mortally wounded, while the boy, by an incredible display of address and activity, was enabled to escape. The deserter beheld his father fall, and throwing himself from his horse, he ran up to the spot where the old man lay bleeding but still sensible, and falling upon his body besought his forgiveness for being the unwilling cause of his death, and wept bitterly. His father evidently recognized him and gave him his hand, but almost instantly afterwards expired. The white men now called upon him to conduct them at a gallop to the spot where the canoe was buried, expecting to reach it before the Indian boy and intercept him. The deserter, in vain, implored them to compassionate his feelings. He urged them that he had already sufficiently demonstrated the truth of his former assertions, at the expense of his father's life, and earnestly entreated them to permit his younger brother to escape. His companions, however, were inexorable. Nothing but the blood of the young Indian would satisfy them, and the deserter was again compelled to act as a guide. Within 2 hours they reached the designated spot. The canoe was still there, and no track could be seen upon the sand, so that it was evident that their victim had not yet arrived. Hastily dismounting, they tied their horses and concealed themselves within close rifle shot of the canoe. Within 10 minutes after their arrival, the Indian appeared in sight, walking swiftly towards them. He went straight to the spot where the canoe had been buried, and was in the act of digging it up, when he received a dozen balls through his body, and leaping high into the air, fell dead upon the sand. He was scalped and buried where he fell, without having seen his brother, and probably without having known the treachery by which he and his father had lost their lives. The deserter remained but a short time in Bourbon County, and never regained his tranquility of mind. He shortly afterwards disappeared, but whether to seek his relations in Virginia or Pennsylvania, or whether disgusted by the ferocity of the whites, he returned to the Indians, has never yet been known. He was never heard of afterwards. So that's the end of this story about the man who had been captured and raised by the Indians, and then deserted them when they came to make war on Kentucky settlers. This next story is shorter and also less dreary. It tells of the heroism of a Mrs. John Merrill in defense of her frontier home in 1791. During the summer, the house of Mr. John Merrill of Nelson County, Kentucky, was attacked by the Indians and defended with singular address and good fortune. Merrill was alarmed by the barking of a dog about midnight, and upon opening the door in order to ascertain the cause of the disturbance, he received the fire of 6 or 7 Indians, by which his arm and thigh were broken. He sank upon the floor, and called upon his wife to shut the door. This had scarcely been done when it was violently assailed by the tomahawks of the enemy, and a large breach soon effected. Mrs. Merrill, however, being a perfect Amazon both in strength and courage, guarded it with an axe, and successively killed or badly wounded 4 of the enemy as they attempted to force their way into the cabin. The Indians then ascended the roof and attempted to enter by way of the chimney, but here again they were met by the same determined enemy. Mrs. Merrill seized the only feather bed which the cabin afforded, and hastily ripping it open, poured its contents upon the fire. A furious blaze and stifling smoke ascended the chimney, and quickly brought down 2 of the enemy, who lay for a few moments at the mercy of the lady. Seizing the axe, she dispatched them, and was instantly afterwards summoned to the door, where the only remaining savage now appeared, endeavoring to effect an entrance while Mrs. Merrill was engaged at the chimney. He soon received a gash in the cheek, which compelled him with a loud yell to relinquish his purpose, and return hastily to Chillicothe, where, from the reports of a prisoner, he gave an exaggerated account of the fierceness, strength, and courage of the Long Knife squaw. So that is the end of this short account of Kentucky border life, where Mrs. Merrill defended herself and her husband from several Indians who assailed their home in 1791, after they had shot her husband. That account came from Jospeh Pritts' 1838 book, Incidents of Border Life. I am now going to read another short account of the same attack from Reverend James B. Finley's book, Life Among the Indians, or Personal Reminiscences and Historical Incidents, Illustrative of Indian Life and Character. This book was published all the way back in 1860. As you'll see, some of the details of this story are slightly different. The story is titled, The Legend of Mrs. Merrill. Another and perhaps still more striking instance of female heroism occurred in 1791 in Nelson County. The house of a Mr. Merrill was assaulted by savages. Hearing the dogs barking, Mr. Merrill opened the door to ascertain the cause. He was fired at and fell wounded into the room. The savages attempted to rush in after him, but Mrs. Merrill and her daughter succeeded in closing the door. The assailants began to hew a passage through it with their tomahawks, and having made a hole large enough, one of them attempted to squeeze through it into the room. Undismayed, the courageous woman seized an axe, gave the ruffian a fatal blow as he sprang through, and he sunk quietly to the floor. Another and still another followed, till 4 of the number had met the same fate. The silence within induced one of them to pause and look through the crevice in the door. Discovering the fates of those who had entered, the savages resolved upon another mode of attack. 2 of their number clambered up to the top of the house, and prepared to descend the broad wooden chimney. This new danger was promptly met. Mrs. Merrill did not desert her post, but directed her little son to cut open the feather bed, and pour the feathers upon the fire. This the little fellow did with excellent effect. The 2 savages, scorched and suffocated, fell down into the fire, and were soon dispatched by the children and the wounded husband. At that moment a 5th savage attempted to enter the door, but he received a salute upon the head from the axe held by Mrs. Merrill that sent him howling away. Thus 7 of the savages were destroyed by the courage and energy of this heroic woman. When the sole survivor reached this town, and was asked what news, a prisoner heard his reply, "Bad news! The squaws fight worse than the Long Knives." The above story I have often heard from the lips of Mrs. Merrill herself. She was a member of the Methodist Episcopal Church. After the death of her first husband, she was married to a Mr. Hunter. She settled on Paint Creek in 1797, and subsequently died there, in the triumphs of faith. So that is from Reverend Finley's 1860 book, Life Among the Indians. One major difference from the account and incidents of border life is that in Reverend Finley's account it was her sons who dumped the feathers into the fire, and then they and their father killed the 2 Indians who fell down the chimney. Her daughter also helped her protect the door. In this same chapter he also relates another story about 2 boys who were captured near Short Creek, Kentucky, around this same time period. Here's what happened to them. One more anecdote must close this chapter. 2 boys, Henry and James Johnson, living on Short Creek, on the west bank of the Ohio. While at play some distance from the house, were taken prisoners by two savages. They were led several miles into the wood, and then the Indians built a fire and lay down for the night, each holding one of the captive boys in his arms. The younger wept bitterly at finding himself in the hands of the savage monsters, but his older brother tried to comfort him. The little one soon fell asleep in the muscular arms of his master. The other slept not, his mind was too busy. At length, finding his keeper sound asleep, he gradually slipped from his arms, and arose to his feet. He might have run away and escaped, but there was his little brother asleep in the arms of his savage master, and he would not leave him. At first he stepped around, and to try the soundness of the Indians' sleep, he renewed the fire, knowing if they awoke, and found him thus occupied it would occasion no alarm. But their sleep was too profound to be disturbed. He then walked up to his brother, and gently woke him, and drew him from the embrace of his master. The older brother put the muzzle of one of their guns to the ear of one of the Indians, and directed his brother to put his finger on the trigger, and pull it the moment he saw the hatchet descending on the head of the other. The plan succeeded. The tomahawk descended, and the gun went off at the same moment. The first blow of the tomahawk was not fatal. "Lay on," cries out the little fellow, "I have done it for mine." A few more blows from the older boy did it also for the other Indian. The two boys immediately started for home, and just as the day was dawning they came round the corner of the log cabin, and heard their mother in agony lamenting their hard fate, and saying that they had been taken prisoners and perhaps killed by the Indians. The joy of that meeting it would be difficult to describe, but we can readily conceive of the pride and delight with which that mother listened to the narrative of the heroic achievements of her two sons. So that's it for this episode. This last story is similar to the famous story of Hannah Duston, who, with the help of an older woman and a boy, killed all of their captors after she was kidnapped in Massachusetts in 1697. Here, two boys from Kentucky living near the Ohio River escaped in a similarly brutal manner. These were just some of the incidents of border life on the western frontier during the first years of our new republic. As mentioned earlier, we have a previous video on the attack on the home of the Widow Scraggs that occurred just before these events. Check the description for the link to that video. This channel is called Unworthy History because we cover actual history that has been deemed unworthy to show on history channels on TV. Here on this channel we keep actual history alive by reading directly from old books, written down long ago by people whose shoes we are unworthy to stand in. If you'd like to support our channel's mission, then you can join our Patreon page or become a YouTube channel member. Members will have access to all of our members-only videos, and your contribution towards keeping actual history alive will be recognized at the end of each episode. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.